Okay.
Okay, so we're ready when you are. We're recording.
Queen of the Andes is one of the rarest flowers in the high Andes Mountains. They bloom just once every 100 years. The reason they take so long to bloom, sometimes decades, is because of the environment that they inhabit, which is normally barren and harsh. They grow enormously tall and store vast amounts of nutrients. Despite being rare, they produce millions of seeds, giving hope to the next generation.
I was thinking about KCC and how it grew from small beginnings.
I'm sure that when people rang in there, they were imagining this large organisation.
Yes.
We were in the kitchen and there was a telephone call from Sweden. And you said, yes, yes, thank you. This is KCC. And yes, I'll just go through to our finance department. And then you move from one end of your work surface to the other end of the work surface. Yes, I can see your...
I always knew when John was in the office. This was when we moved to Wyville Court. And do you remember Susan was always serious because Susan was doing an enormous amount of work. But we always knew when John was in the building because you would hear the lift coming up and the steps going through. And next minute, there was Susan laughing. And John had told her a joke. He was brilliant at the jokes.
When we used to go down to KCC, we used to sleep and stay in Susan and Peter's house.
Yes.
And we all used to cram together and we used to pile up under the roof. And John Burnham, because he was there most often, I think, ended up saying, no, I sleep in the hall downstairs. So in front of the front door, John Burnham used to roll up in a sleeping bag and sleep. Nobody could come in. The house was packed, and breakfast in the morning, everybody was just piling in. Sometimes we used to sit through the night and just talk and drink. But those were just magic times.
All the ideas, the things that Peter brought in, but the people that Peter brought in. Certainly Barnett Pearce, Vernon Cronin were such regular people there. And we did say we would talk about human systems. The journal in '89, Peter sent me and Barnett Pearce down to a pub over lunch so that we could invent human systems. And it started publishing in the middle of 1990. Had a tradition of starting publishing each year in the middle of that year. They were just extraordinary experiences.
When we moved to South Lambeth Road, we got the room set up, but we hadn't got any curtains. Peter said, come on, Kate, we'll go to John Lewis and look for some curtains.
Oh, yes.
So off we trotted and they said, oh, I'm sorry, they're 2 weeks order, we haven't got them in stock. And Peter said, oh dear, that's so difficult. We've got Prince Charles coming to open our therapy centre on Friday. What can we do? And they said, right, leave it to us. Needless to say, we got them the day before. But I stood there, honestly, Peter was so naughty.
There was a sort of coherence between Peter the person and Peter the teacher, and he was one, really. He'd fly back from somewhere, arrive early in the morning, come straight to KCC, and then still be teaching at sort of 9:30 or 10 at night. And I think maybe it was something to do with the enthusiasm, the genuine enthusiasm and love of the ideas that he was talking about.
I was just thinking about how the theory was so exciting. You know, we were so engaged in it and so taken over with it. And I'm not sure that I've met that kind of furnace of ideas and creativity anywhere else.
In Kensington Church Street, when we got the paper, you know, the coordinated management of meaning, and I remember us sitting in the group trying to make sense of it.
Yes.
It was so funny. But then we were so lucky because they came, and a few weeks later they were behind the screen. They did communication, but they learned a lot about therapy through us.
I first met Peter and Martin in 1982 at a conference in Calgary that Carl Tom had organized. And the theme of that conference was bringing the Milan Associates together with Barnett Pearce and Vernon Cronin, CMM theorists.
I had known Vern and Barnett as well, partly because they had heard of social construction and wanted me to come and talk about that. And they were obviously both very much tied up with the creation of meaning, or the making of meaning, you might say. They had their own sort of more systemic orientation in terms of the patterns, but clearly they were overlapping, and clearly we were learning from each other.
When we first connected with KCC, when we talked contexts, we were talking about beliefs. And Peter was adamant about the notion that stories is a better idea. And we were convinced, particularly by listening to casework at KCC, and that had a lasting impression on CMM. Because once you think about the contexts as stories with detail and a future, that opens up all kinds of possibilities.
CMM was in right at the very beginning. And then along came Maturana. And in some ways, it became almost like a choice to follow Maturana or to follow CMM. Even though Bateson thought that Maturana would be his protege. The clarity that CMM offered us compared to the intellectual intoxication that was Maturana were just, in some ways, beautiful, but difficult to grasp and to operationalize. But CMM was so practical, and it helped us to navigate our ways through very complex systems.
When I came on board first, it was in the CMM days. Walking into KCC was like walking into a different language game completely. But the rigor that I saw sitting behind screens at times, watching sessions, and how that was applied with the families, and always from some kind of positive connotation.
The social system of KCC, the people who were there, the sense of their commitment to ideas that facilitated agency and choice. These concepts, like CMM, offer the language for naming what gets created in a unique moment.
I started teaching at KCC immediately after I trained there in the late 80s. And when I started teaching, I think around that time, appreciative inquiry broke into KCC, realized that for me, the heart of inquiry was reflexivity, aspiring myself and helping others to aspire to think about how they're making the system with others.
Once we heard David Cooper-Ryder talking about being appreciative, I think both Peter and I just used that almost for the rest of our professional career. It always meant you were being positive. There was a lot of laughter. We talked about problems almost non-existently, and created ways that the whole family could validate the children, validate each other, dream their futures.
the spirit of KCC for me at that time was hugely exciting, but it was also all about irreverence.
Irreverence, I think the thing that alongside that sense of community, the irreverence and the playfulness and the thinking outside of the box, and it's okay to do that. The irreverence I still very much attribute to my time in KCC.
I suppose what I associate with KCC is, of course, curiosity, but also that real sense of wonder that Peter Lang and many others brought to it. And that is something I've tried to hold on to, even in difficult times. But really that sense of wonder and hope and seeing the resources in people and systems and really making the work enjoyable.
Peter and Martin had started KCC as something very new, very different, very explicitly focused on what was then called Milan systemic therapy and the ideas that developed. And they were instrumental in developing those ideas as it sort of moved from a first order approach to a second order approach.
When I entered KCC, I think that the first thing that I noticed was that there were real practical interventions that were solidly based in a theoretical orientation that just gave me so much more opportunity of working usefully. The way that they embraced the Milan ideas, but introduced some novelty, driving ideas forward and creating a body of knowledge and a family of practitioners and a community that really remained connected and still is.
The Hertfordshire KCC part, because there was a big group of training happening in Hertfordshire, and then what was happening in London. And of course, there was always Denmark, and there was all these training organizations happening in other parts. And I think it was always very exciting, particularly when we had this real creativity of really using space in the community to make a rich training context, but also to really be part of a community.
For me, there was a spirit of kind of inclusiveness. And it connects to that sense of community. But I think the kind of practices that KCC had about opening up, for example, to people who didn't have a prior profession, which is a big issue these days in how we're going forward, but in having non-traditional backgrounds, welcoming lots of people from very different backgrounds into the training. That to me was a very, very important part of who KCC was.
I mean, this started in some ways because of Peter Lang's own experience. He trained with Martin at the TAVI, and then because Peter didn't have a prior professional training in one of the so-called helping professions, he applied for membership at another organisation in London and was turned down on this basis. So he said, I'll set me own up then. And so
I just arrived to London. I knew one thing, I wanted to train as family therapist. And then I remember searching for training. I remember just reading on the website like that this is a place which welcomes students from diverse background, and it kind of invited this certainty in me that I would belong.
When I joined KCC, I joined that because the course was advertised in what was known as the Voice newspaper, the Black Voice newspaper, which was a newspaper specifically for minorities. Through that, as I say, commitment to opening up the ideas to anybody, I was able to get on the course. That particular year when I started KCC, there was a bus driver, there was a bookkeeper, there was a nun, there was an occupational therapist, and there was somebody who was unemployed. That was me.
sometimes you saw people without the prior professional qualification, but were just much more talented in working with relationships because previous professional trainings took in some ways trained that out of you. They trained you in assessments and classifications and labels and trained you out of talking to people and relationships and so on.
There was a lot in what was going on at KCC that was non-individualist. It took reason away from the private individual and put it into the sets of relationships, which is very much part of the more general movement at the time.
It was also a huge focus on giving voice to those who don't usually have voice. And I saw that for several years. I was an external examiner on their diploma program. Almost all of them were focused on this idea of, of giving voice, whether it's a minority of some kind or just a underrepresented population.
What I remember of the community of KCC was the multiplicity, heterogeneity, so many different people, so many different ideas, all welcomed, always, interested in something, in otherness.
One of the things I really liked about KCC was they met you wherever you were. For me, it felt like I could be me. I didn't have to be someone else or pretend to be in something else that was made up. I felt that I was always being invited. So you're not a clone of someone else, you're you, but developed in the way you want to be developed.
I feel like KCC was ahead of its time in the most amazing way, and I kind of didn't realize it at the time. And maybe not as much as it should be, but there is kind of talk in the wider discourse now about privilege and power and identity politics, and that was bread and butter there.
I was just thinking about how power positions people, and I was also thinking about how power has positioned me in my life as a Black woman, working class woman, and how I came to KCC because I was very much drawn to the values that it stood for with respect to challenging and confronting issues of power. And I felt as though for the first time I was involved in a learning community that really spoke to my experience and the ways in which I grew up not really seeing myself present or represented.
One key idea that really grabbed me at the very beginning, I feel that runs through my career. One of the things is about like trying to get the students to understand what is the impact of what you have been through, influence the way you operate, the meanings you give, the language you use, and the position you take.
My background is, I came from poverty. I was the first one to go to do anything like this, so to go to university and then do this kind of course. And I think that what I'm discovering now is an awareness of activism.
So linking to Danny's point about activism and linking to social graces, because people don't always understand the social graces fully, I think. If we want to have people from diverse backgrounds and create opportunities for people who don't ordinarily have them, then we have to do that work. It's actually structurally sort of dismantling some of that stuff. And KCC was doing that way back.
The social graces have brought us so much, but I think they're not where it ends. KCC gave me that in my training in terms of CMM as another model that I hold just as dear. And when I do train others, I'll talk about CMM and I'll talk about the graces alongside each other. And then when I discovered intersectionality as a theory, which had been around for ages in critical race theory, and it was suddenly like, oh, there's this other thing out there that's enormous. It just seemed to make a lot of sense in terms of really being able to unsettle systems and muddle things up and make things complicated again.
Something that I think was quite unique about KCC is actually the incredible coherence between the ideas that we were exploring at the time and the way in which the teaching was done. Mm-hmm. And I think that was fantastic because right from the beginning, it was that space. Every class, every session in KCC from year 1 to year 4 was a discussion, a co-creation of ideas between people. Even before we were talking about co-creation, it was what was happening. It's like the relationship between tutors and students, and it was amazing. And I think that a lot of the energy, the creativity, the excitement was happening because the way in which we were talking with each other all the time was reflecting that.
Charles, you were behind the desk and saw everything happening, the coming and going, and you must have some stories of KCC.
Sometimes it'd be a bit chaotic, people would turn up in the morning and I'm here for the workshop, and I'd be, oh, what workshop is that? And I'd be kind of running around, trying to set up a workshop. No idea who was going to turn up, whether it be 10 or 50 people, and running to Sainsbury's down the road to get the milk and the biscuits. I'm sure it made no money at all.
No.
Referring to Charles's thing of chaos, and if you look at the London setup with the TAVI, Institute of Psychiatry and IFT, KCC was the poor cousin. It had to prove itself. It didn't have any benefactor. There was no budget money coming in from anywhere else other than it generated on its own. Nobody made a lot of money. KCC.
It's important to recognize that there were this kind of paradox of living in a world where money matters and structure matters. If you're going to be an institution, you need to follow these kinds of structures. You can play around the edges of it, but pretty much, you need to have the organizational chart, and know what people are doing and what the mission is, and carry forward and have the finances there. And Peter and Martin kind of eschewed that, for good reason, not wanting that to be the driving force. But in the end, it's really hard to sustain something that doesn't buy into that formal structure and the fact that money is what makes things work.
We actually graduated that day in Luton. I think it might have been you, Dawn, that called to say this had happened. And, here we were celebrating and, this great achievement. But at the same time, it was a sort of sense of sadness for me.
For me, it felt sudden. I wasn't ready. I felt not ready. And but at the same time, all those seeds that was sown in me, it's as if there is also a lifeboat that I can sail on and find anchorage.
I think for me, there's a great sadness, but also I don't know, can I say inevitable? I don't know, but there's something about their generosity, which I spoke about earlier, because they were so generous. And there were people that, I remember a particular client gave 10p, for his session. And that was okay, kind of who they were. So you kind of embodied that way of KCC. And sadly, with that generosity, sadly came the fall of it.
I mean, in many ways, the kindness and the generosity was the demise. The kindness that was given to so many clients in terms of sort of, not charging an absolute minimal costs and things like that.
The image for me was like a bolt out of the blue and wrecking the ship. However, the ship was no more, but there were loads of lifeboats, and everyone, there's almost like needing to keep going and going off in all different directions, and surviving through and building, this incredible resilience and somehow the spirit and the ideas and the people and the people who are no longer with us now. They're here with us in the conversation. I think, you know, and there's something that was my image really, but that initial, what's happened to the ship? What's happened to the ship?
It did feel like that at the time. It felt like it was the end of an institution, but the life of KCC, it can't die. It's not, you know, life of that nature does not die because it's intrinsically integrated into the way of human living.
It was not about any one person or any one group, but it was this ever expanding circle and overlapping. That kind of flowed into other groups in Denmark and in Norway. And there's just this sort of almost like nomads, you know, kind of following the thread of these ideas. The Bedfordshire professional doctorate that Gail Simon directs, like it's still going, you know, and that is a legacy of that started with KCC. I think, in fact, John Schotter, he went to KCC and started working for KCC. And part of what he was assigned to do is to try to develop a relationship with the university. In fact, they were able to do that.
I always felt that we had a very unique group of tutors with Peter Lang, Martin Little, and John Schotter. A lot of their work, I think, went on behind the scenes and trying to create something different. I remember Peter Lang, he wasn't at all reassuring in his questions. He opened space. He invited new ways of conceptualizing a thesis, research, and so on. He wasn't going to reproduce some kind of instructive, pre-existing format of what you should be doing at doctoral level. Instead, I remember him saying, we don't yet know what a systemic doctorate can look like.
And it felt like a perfectly okay place to be able to think in that sort of way, to not know in advance what you were going to do in a way. It was a place where you could do and make before you had any way of articulating that within some sort of theoretical framework. And that was what was so exciting, I think. It was that it came from within the practice.
It's part of a deliberate attempt to loosen and extend some of our attachments on some of the earlier systemic theory. So the new materialist, indigenous work and work from Black scholars has been largely ignored in the development of systemic theory. There's something we can do from this position of being in the university to take a different perspective sometimes on who's out there and what their contributions have been.
I suppose one of the other things that's come out of it is Murmurations.
Oh my goodness, yes. Murmurations, Journal of Transformative Systemic Practice.
For us, we decide to make a little KCC in Colombia. And we create with Peter and Martin, Sistemas Humanos. All these connections are very influenced for us. All this capacity of Peter to link people and give new ideas. Not this is the truth. No, this is a new idea. Then give to us and how we are growing, with these ideas and link with the connection of the country.
I think one of the loveliest things we've done is created an honorary doctorate for Peter Lang. That was very special. I've got these wonderful pictures in my mind of him in his doctoral robe, being awarded his honorary doctorate in Luton. And we've held festivals as well to honour contributions of members of our own community. So we held one for Peter Lang in 2015. So well attended, so moving. People came from all over the world.
I remember talking to Peter about it when he was ill, and he was saying how people had gone on and were passing on these ideas. For me, it was the memory of infinite possibilities. There was a future in everything. You could change what had gone on. There was a future. And that was what was so welcome, so appreciative, I think. But I know Peter was immensely proud of what he had achieved.
It's just occurred to me looking at the group that we have on this call, and a number of us, all from KCC, have led other institutions in systemic training. And so one of the things that we might not necessarily have thought about as we embarked upon our training with KCC was how instrumental it was in expanding the reach of their way of working, way of teaching, and their influence into other training institutions. I led the Institute of Family Therapy for a number of years, and I was very, very keen that all of the things that I had embraced in KCC would become part of the fabric of the institute that I joined. And I think it's no accident that we've all become influential in a range of other institutes.
I think it was something about, as well, feeling part of something. And that was something that Peter and Martin and you, John, I think made people feel like they were part of something important. Maybe it's something about that that's gone towards creating the sense of community, I think, that people feel now in Friends of KCC.
We looked back on what we have done and together with KCC, and all Gothenburg are systemic now.
The whole of Gothenburg are systemic.
We trained, yes.
Because you've trained the whole of social services in Gothenburg.
Very not the whole, but very many. 50 different trainings around,
and that was a way, of course, to keep it going through the years.
If you look at the dreams people have, the possibilities, the capacity, you always think of it's possible. It's possible. You can do it. You can do it.
If you think about, for KCC, for example, the ideas being about therapy, and now you think about how they've kind of billowed out into, so far beyond therapy, and we still have further to go. I guess that's a hopeful sign, because we can look back and say we've taken these ideas into organizations, communities, education, healthcare, all sorts of places. So let's keep going.
One important question is how do we develop ideas? And I'm talking both of the field of systemic psychotherapy, but also in the direction of contributing to the larger context.